War is often remembered through battles, victories, and historical events, but its deepest effects cannot be measured by the number of lives lost alone. The psychological impact of war continues long after the fighting has ended, affecting individuals, families, and entire societies. Today, I will be comparing The Psychology of War by Professor Nigel McLennan with Timothy Finley's novel The Wars. Although one is a non-fiction article and the other is a historical novel, both examine how war transforms the human mind through fear, trauma, dehumanization, and the struggle to preserve humanity. My argument is that both texts demonstrate that the greatest consequences of war are psychological rather than physical. Throughout the presentation, I will compare the ideas presented in the article with Robert Ross's experiences in the wars while also discussing the literary theory and literary devices that help communicate these powerful messages. One of my favorite quotes from the article, "The desire for war is not hardwired." The quotation introduces McLennan's central argument that war is not an unavoidable part of human nature but is shaped by psychological and social influences. Professor Nigel McLennan begins his article by challenging the common belief that humans are naturally destined to fight wars. He explains that warfare became common only after the societies became organized and political leaders gained power over large groups of people. Throughout the article, he argues that wars are driven by psychological manipulation rather than instinct. Leaders often use propaganda, fear, and the creation of an enemy to convince ordinary people to support violence. He also explains that political ambition, revenge, and groupthink can encourage people to ignore moral values. McLennan concludes that there are no true winners in war because the psychological, emotional, and social consequences affect everyone involved. The novel follows Robert Ross, a young Canadian officer who experiences on the battlefield profoundly change his understanding of humanity, morality, and courage. Rather than portraying war as heroic or glorious, Finley explores its devastating psychological emotional effects on individuals. To Robert's journey, the novel examines themes of fear, trauma, compassion, and the struggle to maintain one's humanity in the face of violence. These ideas closely connect with Professor Nigel McLean's article, making the wars an effective literary exploration of the psychological impact of war. One of the strongest ideas in the psychology of war is that fear is one of the main causes of war. As McLennan states, fear of war creates war. McLennan explains that people are often persuaded to support violence because they fear an attack that may never actually happen. Politicians can use this fear to convince ordinary people that war is necessary for survival. This idea is reflected in the wars to Robert Ross's experiences as a soldier. Robert constantly faces danger and uncertainty, and fear becomes a part of his everyday life. However, Timothy Finley shows that fear does not affect everyone in the same way. While some soldiers become more violent or emotionally detached, Robert continues to struggle with his conscience. This suggests that fear can influence behavior, but individuals still have the ability to make moral choices. Another important idea in the article is dehumanization. McLennan explains that before people are willing to kill others, they are often taught to see the enemy as less than human. As he writes, the other is demonished and dehumanized. Politicians and propaganda create an image of the other as dangerous or evil, making violence seem acceptable. Finley developed this same idea in the wars. Throughout the novel, war reduces people to soldiers, numbers, and casualties. Acts of violence become routine, and compassion is often lost. Robert's kindness towards animals is significant because it shows that he refuses to completely surrender his humanity. The animals symbolize innocence, making Robert's effort to protect them a powerful contrast to the cruelty surrounding him. McLennan also argues that groupthink encourages war. He explains that when those in power are gripped by groupthink, it can quickly start and continue the madness of war. When people are surrounded by others who all share the same beliefs, they stop questioning decision and simply follow the group. This can lead to dangerous choices because no one challenges authority. In the war, soldiers are expected to obey war orders without hesitation. Robert often struggles between following military commands and following his own conscience. Findlay uses Robert's internal conflict to question whether obedience should always come before morality. Both texts suggest that independent thinking is essential, especially during times of conflict. Another important connection between the article and the war is trauma. The article concludes that there are no true winners in war because the psychological consequences remain long after the fighting has ended. As Maclean states, there are no winners in war, only greater or lesser losers. Many soldiers experience post traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, and difficulty returning to normal life. This idea is central to the wars. Robert's experiences change him emotionally and psychologically. Instead of portraying war as glorious, Findlay emphasizes its lasting impact on the human mind. Through Robert's stories, readers understand that the deepest wounds of war are often invisible. Perhaps the most important connection between the article and the wars is the idea of humanity. Although the article explains the psychological reasons why people participate in war, it also suggests that war causes people to lose empathy and moral judgment. Maclean reminds readers that their desire for war is not hardwired. This suggests that people are capable of choosing compassion instead of violence. Finley explores this theme through Robert Ross. Even in the middle of violence, Robert repeatedly chooses compassion over cruelty. His concern for animals and innocent people demonstrates that true courage is not measured by violence, but by the ability to preserve one's humanity despite unimaginable circumstances. Both works ultimately argue that the greatest challenge during war is not simply surviving, but remaining morally and emotionally human. The article, The Psychology of War, supports a psychoanalytic interpretation because it explains how emotions, unconscious motivations, fear, guilt, and trauma influence human behavior. Professor Nigel Maclean argues that the psychological factors shape the decisions people make during war. This idea connects to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which suggests that human behavior is influenced by the id, ego, and superego. The id represents instinctive desires and aggression. The ego makes rational decisions by balancing emotions with reality, and the superego represents a person's moral values and conscience. This theory can also be applied to the wars. Throughout the novel, Robert Ross witnessed violence, death, and suffering, which have a profound impact on his mental and emotional state. His fear, grief, and trauma become more intense as the war progresses, influencing his decisions and changing the way he views the world. Robert's actions often reflect a conflict between his id, which responds to fear, and the instinct to survive, and his superego, which drives him to protect innocent people and animals, even when doing so puts him at risk. His ego attempts to balance these competing forces, making him one of the novel's most psychological complex characters. Instead of presenting Robert as naturally violent, Timothy Findlay shows that his experiences during the war shape his behavior and his internal struggles. The article explains the psychology behind war, while the wars allows readers to experience those psychological effects through Robert Ross. Together, both texts demonstrate that war leaves lasting emotional scars and reveal how the conflict between the id, ego, and superego shapes human behavior during times of violence. Timothy Findlay uses several literary devices in the wars to help readers understand the psychology effects of war. Symbolism is one of the most important literary devices in the novel. Animals, especially horses and rabbits, symbolize innocence, compassion, and the natural world. Robert Ross' determination to protect animals reflects his desire to preserve his humanity in the midst of violence and destruction. Another important device is imagery. Finlay uses vivid descriptions of the battlefield, including mud, smoke, blood, and destruction, to create a realistic picture of war. These powerful images allow readers to experience the fear, chaos, and emotional suffering that soldiers faced during World War I. Finlay also uses juxtaposition, placing moments of kindness and compassion beside scenes of violence and death. This contrast highlights how war destroys innocence while emphasizing Robert Ross' struggle to remain compassionate despite the brutality surrounding him. Together, these literary devices reinforce the novel's central message that the greatest impact of war is not only physical destruction but also the psychological and emotional damage it causes. In conclusion, the psychology of war and the wars both show that the greatest impact of war is on the human mind, while Professor Nigel Maclean explains that the psychological causes and consequences of war through research and logical reasoning. Timothy Finley illustrates these ideas through Robert Ross' experiences. Together, they demonstrate how fear, trauma, and dehumanization can change people's behavior. But they also show that compassion and humanity can survive even in the darkest circumstances. Comparing these two texts has helped me understand that the true cost of war is not only measured in lives lost but also in the lasting emotional and psychological scars it leaves behind. Thank you.